And now it's time for today's Power to the People expert panel on building a just climate future, centering equity in climate solutions. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished expert panel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Building a Just Future, Centering Equity in Climate Solutions. My name is Jill Tauber. I'm the Vice President of Litigation for Climate and Energy at Earth Justice, and I have the privilege of being your moderator today. Earth Justice is a non-for-profit environmental law organization. For 50 years, we've been working with our partners and our clients to protect health, to preserve magnificent places and wildlife, and to combat the climate crisis and advance an equitable clean energy future. And we are thrilled to be an official policy program partner for Climate Week NYC 2021. So let's jump into today's session about a just climate future. The climate crisis is here. That's never been clearer. From raging wildfires to chronic droughts to destructive hurricanes and deadly heat, climate fuel disasters are happening across the globe and everyone is impacted. And while climate change is touching all of our lives, though, we know that the harms are not experienced equally. Communities of color, low-income communities, tribal and indigenous communities are hit first and worst by climate change and have long had to bear the unjust burden of pollution and suffer the negative health consequences. The intersecting crises of climate change, of environmental injustice, of racial injustice, of economic justice demand holistic solutions. And those are solutions that confront these crises head on by centering them in justice and equity. Today, we're going to talk about what that means. What does that mean for climate action? What do equitable and just climate solutions look like? Are they within reach? What's happening in DC? What's happening across the country in the fight for a just climate future? We'll be hearing from three justice champions, three leaders who are working to advance equitable and just climate solutions and secure a healthy future for us all. Our first panelist is U.S. Representative A. Donald McEachin. Congressman McEachin was first elected to represent the 4th Congressional District in Virginia in 2016. During his first term in Congress, he co-founded the United for Climate and Environmental Justice Congressional Task Force, which he continues to co-lead today. Congressman McEachin has been selected by his colleagues to serve as the co-chair for the House Democratic Environmental Message Team, to co-chair the Congressional Black Caucus's Transportation, Infrastructure, Environment, and Energy Policy Council, and to vice chair the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition. He's a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Committee on Natural Resources, and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And as is clear from that description that I just said, Congressman McEachin is a leader on climate and environmental justice policy and a dedicated public servant. I know it's a very busy time in Washington, Congressman, and we are so grateful for you to make the time to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to the conversation.
Next, we have Michelle Roberts. Michelle is the National Co-Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, or EJHA. EJHA, a national network of grassroots organizations and advocates who are working in communities disproportionately impacted by toxic chemicals. They support the fight for environmental justice, for a pollution-free economy, and critically needed reform of the chemical industry. Michelle has been providing critical advocacy, organizing, technical support for over 25 years for communities fighting to combat pollution and to live safe, healthy, toxic-free lives. Michelle currently sits on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She is also a spoken word artist and has created a community-based program to advance social justice through the arts. Michelle, thank you so much for being here. And last and certainly not least, Harold Mitchell Jr. Harold is Executive Director of the Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He founded the Regenesis Project in 1997 in response to a wave of respiratory illnesses he was seeing in neighborhoods across his hometown that were near waste and other toxic chemical facilities. Under Harold's leadership, Regenesis Project has successfully leveraged millions of public and private funds to clean up sites, to develop the economy in his community, to secure affordable housing and healthcare for all communities affected by environmental racism. Harold served as a representative in the South Carolina legislature for 13 years and currently serves as a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Harold, thank you so much for being here. So let's get started. Let's jump in. I'd like to open up the conversation and ask all of you, we're facing the devastating impacts of climate change that we're seeing every day. We're seeing the environmental justices across the country. We're also seeing momentum for building bold and equitable climate action with the possibility of historic investments at the federal level. So I'd like to start by asking your reflections about this moment we're in as we mark Climate Week. What are the challenges and opportunities that you see to build towards a just climate future? Congressman, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, and again, thank you for having me on this panel, and I look forward to this discussion. Challenges and opportunities. The challenge is that we've got a limited time frame to get this right. If we're going to pass on a cleaner Earth, or an Earth that's just as clean as the one we found even, we've got to take some action. We've got to take it now. And the challenge really is that Congress is not set up to move that quickly. We're so used to getting consensus on bills before we file them, and rather than getting consensus on the way. And I understand how that evolved, but we may need to think about a little bit about how we as an environmental community decides to do business in terms of getting legislation out the door and onto the floor for consideration. Another challenge is that, and we've seen this repeat itself throughout all of history. Whenever there's a opportunity to redo our economy, whether it's going from industrial to information or whether it's going from agriculture to industrial, there's always a certain group of people who are at the head of the spear, who get to take advantage of all these new opportunities. And by the time the rest of us come along, those opportunities just don't exist, and they don't exist to the degree that they existed when the first group arrived. And that's what our challenge is today. But it's also our opportunity, because we've got a president in the White House who believes in his Justice 40 initiative, who wants to spend money to make sure that communities of color, indigenous communities, tribal communities, cannot just say environmental justice communities, have the opportunity to have job creation as well as job training. So if you can be a worker bee and get all the new skills that are necessary for this green economy that's about to emerge, or I should say, or you can take advantage of entrepreneurial opportunities and create your own business that creates your own wealth in your family as well as in your community. I know we'll have an opportunity to talk about it more, but that's the beauty of the challenge and the opportunity that we face today.
Thank you. Michelle?
Thank you for having us. With the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, and as you indicated, we are fence line communities. Many of those communities are what we call legacy communities. So for us, yes, the challenge is the ongoing issues that our communities have faced for decades, right? And in some degrees, it's been centuries, okay? And then in addition to that, we have a pandemic on top of it. So we're literally in the crosshairs of all of these things. However, the good news about all of that is typically we would have been chasing down elected officials to continue to share the ongoing challenges we had and how it threaded up into this climate crisis. In addition to that, the pandemic. The exceptionally good news about it all is that we have some political will on Capitol Hill. And as you heard Congressman McEachin, he is one of those, what we would call champions and the political and moral will on the Hill. Those folks who had their heart and their ear pressed to the ground, hearing what communities were saying, seeking to try to understand the complexities and conundrums that they were addressed with and dealt with. In addition to that, the ignorance to the understanding of making sure that these interconnected issues were all put together and that they were at a specific table, whether it be policy table or whether it be a table that speaks to the challenges that they are addressing from are confronted with COVID-19 and or the hurricanes and other wildfires and storms that we have. This particular political moment, as Mr. McEachin said, is very important because we're in that, I want to call it our grandmother squeaky window, window, when back in the day, as they say, you would put those windows up in my Aunt Mimi's house. We would put the window up in the kitchen and it had a little spring on it. Remember that if you didn't get it up right, it could snap your fingers, right? But the thing is that community voices are past that window. And they are now engaged in processes like with respect to community voices like the Environmental Justice Health Alliance that are engaged in processes like the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, where they have leveraged and lifted their voices up to be as equal as possible, right? And aligned as possible with some of the most well-financed and endowed national groups who may have told them before, we have to address this low-hanging fruit and then we may get to you, only now for them to understand it must be rooted and grounded in our experience. And in addition to that, having a president from the state that I am originally from, no doubt, the great state of Delaware, that said on the heels of Hurricane Ida, you know what? Climate change is real. It is a crisis. We are dealing with this crisis. We are dealing with a systemic racism issue. We are dealing with a health crisis, and we must look at, and democracy, and we must look at how it is that we address all of them in totality, making sure we leave no one behind. Now, that's not something that we'll be able to handle overnight, but the good news is that, as they say in the 12-step program, just the first part of it is admitting the problem, right? And then we can begin to build from there. And that's the good news for us, at least right here in this political moment of now. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Harold?
Yes. And I would say, to echo both my colleague Michelle and our champion, what we call our champion on the Hill, Congressman McEachin, that's the opportunity. I mean, we've seen the challenges and lived through the challenges. Now is looking at this opportunity, which the pandemic has really forced us to set that or hit the reset button on things that were, how you kick the can down the road where you don't want to address issues. But this pandemic, George Floyd, this, 2020 was a time that actually forced this country to look at the issues that, when you look at environmental justice leaders who have talked about the impacts, and then to be able to see this, the only thing you had to do is just look at the zip codes of those that were in those areas inundated by the environmental assaults, cumulative impacts. Those were the ones that tested positive the fastest and died the quickest. And so it's kind of a proving point. Even the climate deniers, you can't deny these extreme weather patterns that we see now. And so it's almost a thing that things have brewed to a point that where now you have the EJ for All bill that Congressman McEachin was working on prior to all of this. And it makes it so relevant now And to have a president who takes a focus on environmental justice and climate, the way President Biden has done thus far, and putting frontline community voices at the table, creating the WEJAC, the Environmental Justice Advisory Council, now, that's where the hope lies. So many times before, a lot of our ancestors who thought about having the word environmental justice lifted up, it was part of the presidential conversation during the 2020 election cycle. And so the thing is, now that we see Justice 40, resources, commitments, it's a thing now that there's hope, but there's a fear that we don't lose sight of looking at the timing on this. We can talk all day long, but it's now time for that implementation of these ideas and merging these coalitions and educating, the public and the masses, and building these coalitions to actually get these resources into the communities that President Biden has looked at regarding the 40% commitment. But Justice 40 is a tool, and this is something that should become the norm. And I have hope in it because 20 years ago, when Senator Fritz Hollings and Jim Clyburn were able to use an interagency approach, as you stated earlier in your introduction, we were able to take a $20,000 small grant and leverage that into $300 million. This is what Justice 40 looks like today. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to, get this initiated and pushed into the states where we see our environmental justice oversight committees that are established to look at the oversight of this Justice 40 to make sure that we get it done right, connecting the dots from the federal government to the states and local governments to hit those disadvantaged communities. So there's a lot of hope when you see, all of that, and having not just EPA, but all the federal agencies address the systemic problems that we've seen in our communities for decades.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, everyone. Harold, you mentioned resources, and that's this moment we're in of seizing on those resources. And we have potentially a once in a generation opportunity at the federal level for historic investments to advance environmental justice and climate reform with the infrastructure legislation, with the reconciliation package. Congressman McEachin, it was thrilling to see the climate and environmental justice investments that in the bill that your committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, reported out last week. We're really grateful for your work there, and would love to ask you to talk about some of the key provisions that came out of that bill. How would they advance climate and environmental justice?
What you're seeing as we get through this reconciliation process, or as we traverse the reconciliation process, is our attempt to, as I said earlier, or the phrase I used earlier was green our economy. This is our opportunity to make sure that we have adequate charging stations across the nation for the electrical vehicles that are coming. This is our opportunity as the federal government to incentivize the making and the manufacturing of electrical vehicles. Hence, we'll pass legislation that will require the post office to buy electrical vehicles. Can you imagine a fleet of postal vehicles that are all electric? We're putting monies together to encourage localities to make sure their school buses are electrified. So, and you wonder why the price tag is so big. We are reinventing an economy, and we're trying to do it on $3.5 trillion, which is not that much money in the grand scheme of things. There are estimates that say that we should be spending closer to 10 trillion, but we are where we are, and we're going to try to do the best we can with this $3.5 trillion. And again, part of this money that Harold talked about, and I've spoken about, and Michelle's spoken about, is this notion of Justice 40, and making sure that the grant monies are in place so that when these communities come to the federal government and say, here's our idea, this is what we need to clean up, give us the money and get out of our way. For too long, Washington has tried to make one size fit all for these communities, when we know I know we'll get into this later too, when we know that these communities are in a better position to know what solves their problems than Washington could ever know. And what they really need are the resources. They've got the talent, they've got the expertise, they need the hard, cold cash to make this happen. And so those are some of the things that we've been working on throughout this reconciliation process. And I'm hopeful that we'll deliver a product to the American people that will be emerald green. How about that?
I like it. Thank you, Congressman. Michelle, you spoke about the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. It's work that I know you and Harold, Earth Justice, has the privilege of being there with so many other environmental justice leaders, national environmental groups. And that's a process that laid out a vision for this just and equitable future. Could you talk about some of the solutions that we're advocating for on that platform and how you see us getting closer to that vision?
Yes, thank you for that. Those solutions that we have been advocating for together have been solutions that have pushed the mark, what we would say, and pushed the envelope even further by through the political courage we saw in the evolution of the EJ for All Act, where many of our impacted community members were engaged in scoping that bill. We equally brought those challenges and concerns to the Equitable and Just Climate National Platform process and shared with our national friends that we've had enough of low-hanging fruit bills. We need to push high and push hard for our communities to seek the resolve that they need. And what do we mean by that? We need more than a carbon centric approach. We need to look at how we address a full-on mandatory emissions reductions approach to this crisis, because at the end of the day, our communities, again, are suffering worse, first and worse. And many of these communities aren't even working in these industries that are actually located in fence line to their communities, wherein some of them may have family members working in these industries. However, the works that they are doing are nowhere near even covered under perhaps adequate medical health coverage and the likes thereof. In addition to that, we need better infrastructure for the communities that their housing and their homes are built in. As we know, all communities were not built equal. We have a negative stain on this country with respect to racial segregation that embedded itself in our housing structures and then it continued to bleed over into our banking infrastructure, thereby creating redlining and what have you. So we want to make sure that we are addressing the cumulative impacts and the cumulative effects on communities. In addition to, as we are building to build stronger and better for our communities, some well-intended infrastructures were built, such as in Wilmington, Delaware. When we think about some of the newer housing structures that were built, however, they were built in flood zone areas that we did not include that of a climate resiliency and adaptation plan to the building process. So there were some challenges with that. So we need to make sure that we have governance structures and mandates that really address this, and we prioritize our communities for making sure that when we talk about clean energy, that it is clean, equitable, and just. All three words, not just one. because we all know at the end of the day, we are still grappling. I'm a scientist with how clean is clean. But for us, if you put just in the front of it all, we will get to the clean. And so this is where, and making sure that our structures like our historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, land grants, those institutions are properly financed and plugged into the process so that in this new economy that we're speaking to, that we are all part of the economy, especially when we look at communities who have been marginalized and left out for centuries. This is our new Jerusalem. This is what we call the beloved community. And I'm going to say one quick piece. The window is short now, is really short right now, because when you really think about it and look at the systemic impacts of societal issues, we have a chance of getting it right to show our elders who have lived through that degradation can see it before, as they say, they go on to glory. And what I mean by that is we have stories because of the fact, and solutions, because of the fact that we come as an intergenerational society of impacted people, where it is time. It is way past time to let love lead the way into making sure that we are all honoring our earth. And that's what the Equitable and Just Climate National Climate Platform process is doing, because we are putting our issues at the center. We're putting justice at the center of the solution. And at the end of the day, that's what it should be about.
Thank you, Michelle. Harold, I'd love to ask you, I know both you and Michelle are on the WEJAC, serving on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Could you talk about how the council is guiding and supporting policymaking to secure these just climate solutions? What has the WEJAC been focusing on? What do you expect the work ahead to be?
Yes, I would say with the recommendations, first and foremost, that help guide the interim guidance was to look at a lot of the regulatory barriers, roadblocks that, from different regions around the country that have impacted. And we saw the lessons learned from the ERA dollars that didn't hit the ground with President Obama, and looking at just the reality when you look at the Black Belt, those red states, where in this climate, there are going to be folks, the obstructionists, they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that it's a failed administration. So we have to be real and understand, what is promised, what is looked at may not hit the ground unless we're strategic in identifying what was the problems and having these resources, hit the ground before during the ERA funds. In South Carolina, Nikki Haley, because it was Barack Obama, refused to take funding or looking at the expanding Medicaid in South Carolina. Our rural hospitals shut down. People died. That's the reality. And it's not only South Carolina, it's in other places. So a lot of the recommendations that actually went in from the WEJAC to CEQ was to make sure, looking at, what we know are going to be problems, and being able to also put the guardrails on for many of these federal agencies, because when you look, especially in the South, a lot of the Black and brown members are in those red states controlled by the crazy red governors. And so being able to help identify and guide and to remove those roadblocks so that, there is a chance and opportunity for these resources to hit the ground into those disadvantaged pockets. We just have to look at it with realistic lenses of, the climate that we're in right now. And I will say, Jill, I'm sorry, but there are a couple of things as far as the executive order, as well as the Justice 40 working group. and the screening tool working group, which Michelle led, to look at a lot of those issues and challenges that we have. And it's just basically being able to identify this, because just because the president says, I want this across all federal agencies, doesn't mean that folks are going to embrace and do that. And we know from EPA with the public participation and community engagement process, you know, all agencies haven't done that before. And when you talk about climate and environmental justice, most agencies are going to rub their heads and figure out why and where do we fit in this. And we know, like Health and Human Services, as what's been talked about here, you know, the challenges with the pandemic and, you know, the lack of access. Here you have federally qualified health centers that are geared and designated for those particular communities and people who don't have access to care. Funny thing about it is that for the last 5 years, the federally qualified health centers has been the largest provider of primary care service in the country. But yet and still, there's a disconnect. And this is where there's an opportunity now to make sure that these New Start applications, programs, 340B pharmacy program, which discounts, you know, your prescription drugs up to 60%, our folks in these disadvantaged communities and areas will be able to have access. And so it's really looking at a lot of what we didn't have access to before and looking at the EJ for All bill that Congressman McEachin has been pushing and opened up. I mean, it's kind of like it's like the perfect storm that we have. And that's why looking at the opportunity and the window that we have to get it right and be able to implement it is so important.
Thanks, Harold. And I'd love to turn it to you, Congressman McEachin, to talk about that landmark piece of legislation that you introduced, Environmental Justice for All Act. Could you talk about how it was developed, the conversations, the outreach that you did across the country in communities, and about some of the provisions that will combat environmental injustice?
Sure, and you all are kind to give me credit for the bill, but the reality is that the chair of natural resources, Raul Rahava, and I worked on this together, and we can't even take credit for the bill because what we did over a 2-year time period was that we talked to as many EJ communities and as many EJ advocates as we could. We put things online to get input. We tried to come up with a set of principles that any EJ Fall Act should incorporate, and that's how that bill got developed. So in a very real sense, Raul and I were scriveners. In a very real sense, this bill was written by the people, for the same people, to help these people. And it's based on a really simple premise, if you think about it. I mean, you know, simplicity is not Washington's forte, unfortunately, but it's really based on a simple premise. As I said earlier, these communities, while they are all EJ communities, they are different communities. They have different sets of problems and they have different sets of solutions. And so rather than us come in as the great hope from Washington and say, hey, here's your solution, EJ Fall says, let's go to them, let them come up with their solutions, and let's make sure that we give them the sufficient funding and get out of their way while they implement those solutions. And we always have the ability to monitor what's going on. It's not just handing them a blank check, but it is about letting them implement their solutions to their problems. Another thing that the bill does is it gives folks a cause of action under the Civil Rights Act to go forward and sue for clean air and clean water. You know, for too long, folks have had to wait on an aggressive Attorney General's office or even DOJ to come in and sort of save the day when it comes to litigation. No, what this legislation says is you go ahead, you got a problem, you go get yourself a lawyer, you get yourself in court and file the appropriate motions and actions and get your problem resolved. It also puts into another, what I think is common sense suggestion is cumulative impact. You know, the way we do business today, even today still, is that if you have a community that is about to get a new project in They look at the project, they see how much the project puts out in pollutants. If it falls under a certain number, it gets the thumbs up. Never mind what else is already going on in that community. They may have 3 or 4 fence line polluters who have made life miserable there. And when you add the 5th one, because that one, at least within its own individual silo, passes muster, you end up making the whole thing collapse. Because when you add it all together, you've blown way past any tolerance that any community should have for a polluter or group of polluters. Let me, if I can, just deviate for 1 minute, because I'm scared we're not going to get this concept in place. And we need to remember, as worthy as they are of funding, there's a difference between EJ communities and justice communities. And when I say justice communities, the communities I'm talking about are those who have, or I should say just transitional communities, those who have historically been dependent upon coal and fossil fuels to generate their economy, to make a living. They're going to need money to help transition. What they don't need, and what should not happen, is it shouldn't be the same pile of money. Let us not get into a fight over who gets the money. Money needs to be set aside for transitional. Money needs to be set aside for EJ. How we got to these 2 places were entirely different. EJ communities didn't go out and advocate to have these industries come in. These industries were put upon, if you will, EJ communities. And in my judgment, that entitles them to a separate pot of money. And the transitional communities, they were using cutting edge technology that we've just found a better way to do stuff. We found a cleaner way to do stuff. So we're not trying to penalize them, but we are trying to make sure they get their own set of money so there's not a fight between the 2 entities, because there's nothing more that Washington loves, which is a fight between two groups of folks, both of whom are deserving.
Hey, Jill,
Harold, jump in. Yeah.
I just want to thank Congressman McEachin for your modesty, because with the previous administration, man, it just says a lot about you, because without a champion, the work wouldn't get done, the coalition and getting on the ground. But I just want to thank you for your modesty, because, for those last couple of years before that, it just makes me appreciate you even more, and your modesty from looking at what we saw before, because God knows he would have taken it and run to out there in China by now with what you've been able to do in this moment.
Well, thank you. You're very kind.
Yes, thank you, Mr. McEachin. And that's the other reason why it is so important for us to have and for us to participate in processes like we are doing in the Equitable and Just Climate platform. While, nothing is perfect in totality, but when you have folks who have the moral and political will, consciousness, and faith to go and do what Chairman Grijalva and Mr. McEachin and others are doing, it is incumbent upon us to be able to provide the capacities that many of our communities, especially those legacy communities, need in order to push that ball. If you have folks that are so willing to listen and to hear, just for to call her out, but one of our community leaders, Vi Wahiki of the Alaska Community Action Against Toxics, also on the WEJAC, and she really has a restored sense of faith, although she's been engaged in decades of challenges, but because the hard-lived conversations that they have had over time have fallen onto pieces and bodies of papers that Mr. McEachin and Grijalva and others have put and have directed their staffs to stay committed to. This is what makes us commit to working with our communities to make sure that they are better resourced and have the capacity that they need to push for those, to be able to push for the voting rights that we need to make sure that we're able to get these solutions that they are so willing to push for. And this is why the political moment of now is so exceptionally important, and even more important for us to really unite together and really push all that we have behind these legacy groups, like you say, in addition to providing the just transition that we need.
Thank you, Michelle. I wish I could sort of go through the screen and high five you. So I'm just going to do a virtual one. So well said. Well, let me end with this. The theme of Climate Week 2021 is getting it done. This is a group that is getting it done. What would in that spirit, what's your advice? What's your charge to people who are watching this? How do they support your work? How do we all come together and help get this done?
Well, let me start off by saying, with advocates like Michelle and Harold, we're not too far away from getting this done, but that's what we need. We need folks who are grassroots oriented, who know how to organize, who know where the people are who need the help the most are, and then can help us motivate them to contact your elected officials. You know, I know it's old style politics. I know it's trite. I know people get tired of it, but politics is a contact sport, and you can't participate if you're not wanting to contact your elected officials. Even if they're ones that agree with you, they still need to hear from you, because trust me, the people who don't agree with us are constantly blowing up my phone. And so every now and then I need to do a program like this to remind myself that I'm not alone. And so you've got legislators out there who are on an island or feel like they're on an island. They need to hear from you, and you tell them what a good job they're doing on whatever issue it is that you think they're doing well on. But more importantly, quite frankly, is those of you who live in red states with red senators or red congressmen who are in charge of representing you, they need to hear from you. You don't need to be ugly, you don't need to be nasty, but you do need to be firm that this is something that you think is a priority, that they need to take up, and that the time for partisan bickering is past. You may not be able to get it done your way, but let's find some compromises and get something positive done. Because, after I wake up in the morning, we'll be one day closer to the climate catastrophe that we're all trying to avoid. So we've got to take action. We needed to take action yesterday. We need to take action today. And we're doggone sure Skippy going to need to take action tomorrow.
The solutions are on the ground, and getting engaged, as the Congressman stated, and Michelle, this is kind of like when you talk about the Industrial Revolution, this is a renewable revolution that's taking place right before us right now. And this is an opportunity to where not only Black and Brown tribal should be, getting trained to put solar panels on a roof, but we should be manufacturing. We should be the suppliers tying in with a lot of these industries. This opportunity that we have right now, looking at community solar down in Louisiana right now, there are people still without power, but smart grid, virtual power plants, now is the time for us to start really looking at this opportunity that we have for resiliency. These storms are getting worse here in the South and across the country. The hurricanes are getting stronger. So these power outages, whether it's winter or summer, we're gonna continue to see this. And what's put on the table right now for us to have this conversation, moving with the Department of Energy and USDA, it's really a time to be able to connect the dots. Food insecurities, food deserts, with aquaponics, hydroponics. There's so much as far as opportunities that our HBCUs have been pushing our 1890 schools, the land grant institutes, on looking at how with these, these communities and laboratories connecting the dots and building this renewable economy that we're a part of, not just observing, and training just to put a panel on or engaging, but those charging stations, who's making the charging stations? All of what we notice about to take place, we need to be a part and engaged. We're only, if you look at it, Black and brown is only 1% of this whole clean economy conversation right now. I would say get engaged, because this is the opportunity now to get engaged and to be, really be a part of, not just an observer.
Yeah, and as we say, we come in a pack. We learn together, from our babies to our grandmas and our grandpas. So what I mean by that, make it plain. We need to also make sure that we are educating ourselves in our communities, with our families, in our faith houses, in our schools, and what have you. And there are resources out there. All you have to do, and this is a self-promote right now, but look at ajustclimate.org, where that work that we reference from the Equitable Just Climate platform is on there. And it does include Mr. McEachin and Mr. Grijalva's bills and all the works that the people's movements are doing. We are really trying to make sure that we are educating ourselves. And then my family, Black, brown, red, my Native, Indigenous brothers and sisters, in the midterm elections, let us turn it out. Because it would be all for naught if we did all of this work and we failed to show up in that midterm. So we need to push for voter rights, but we equally need to take the position that our elders have taught us for centuries to make up our statement known, but making sure we flood the voting booths in the midterm elections, because we still have work to do. We have a lot done, but we still have a lot to go. And we need to make sure that Mr. Grijalva, Mr. McEachin, and others are in place to handle the business.
Congressman McEachin, Michelle, Harold, thank you so much for your work, your inspiring work, your planet critical work, for being here today. I know it's a really busy time. I'm grateful to have been here with you. And I encourage everyone who's listening to stay active, to continue to get it done. As our panelists have said, everyone has a role to play, and we need everyone to play that role. You can visit earthjustice.org to learn more. And I wish everyone a good Climate Week. And thank you again to everyone.
Thank you for joining us. Visit earthjustice.org for more scheduled panels and in-depth expert discussions during Climate Week. We are Earth Justice, wielding the power of law and the strength of partnership to protect people's health, to preserve magnificent places and wildlife, to advance clean energy, and to combat climate change. We're here because the Earth needs a good lawyer. Earth Justice. Learn more at earthjustice.org/02100 and take action by texting climate to 43428.